The wind ran low across the flats of Dustwater Basin, carrying with it the kind of silence that felt like a warning from the earth itself. And as the sun dipped behind the jagged rim of the mesa, a lone mare kicked up the last breath of daylight while Sheriff Elias Crowe rode slow behind her, squinting against the drifting sand until he spotted the faintest shape on the horizon, something small, hunched, trembling, as if the desert had spat out the remnants of a soul it no longer wished to keep. And the closer he rode, the more his chest tightened with that old familiar ache that came when fate whispered a man's name before he ever heard it spoken. He dismounted with a grunt, boots sinking into the warm dust, and when the figure finally lifted her head, he saw a young woman wrapped in a dirt-stained blanket, her face streaked with fear and dry blood, her breaths quick and shallow like a wounded fawn. And before he could offer his hand, she jerked back with a sharp cry. "Don't touch me! There!" she wept, gripping the blanket to her chest, as though the world itself meant to tear it from her. And Elias froze, not in offense but in reverence, because he knew the voice of someone who'd been chased too long by something she could not outrun. And he slowly lowered himself to the ground, knees creaking, palms raised open, letting the dust settle between them the way one might lower a weapon to show peace. The mare behind him snorted and pawed the dirt as if impatient with human pain. But Elias stayed still, his voice low as a creek at midnight as he told her his name, told her no harm would come from him, told her he'd wait as long as she needed before she trusted the air again. And gradually her breathing eased, though he could tell she clung to that blanket, not from modesty alone, but as if it was the last shield between her and the memory that hunted her steps. She whispered at last that her name was Mara. Just Mara. No family, no home she dared claim anymore, and the way. Her eyes darted toward the northern ridge said more than her trembling lips ever could. For Elias had patrolled these plains long enough to know that ridge was where the Holt brothers roamed. 3 men with dust for hearts and cruelty for sport. Men who had burned ranches, cut down travelers, and were said to take what they wanted from anyone unlucky enough to cross paths with them. But Mara couldn't bring herself to speak their names, only stuttered that she'd run and run until her body gave. Out and the sun threatened to finish what those men had started. Elias felt a slow burn in his gut, an old fire he had long tried to bury after losing his own wife to a gang near the same basin years back, and as he studied Mara's torn skin, the bruises blooming across her arms and legs, he understood that destiny had led her straight into the hands of the one man still cursed enough to care. But when he inched closer, not touching her, just shifting so she wouldn't fall forward into the dust, she flinched again and pressed her palms to her ribs, whispering that she didn't want anyone near her wounds, that something inside them felt wrong, a deep throbbing heat as though fire lived beneath her skin. And Elias recognized the signs before she did. Infection, swelling, fever blooming too fast, and he knew she didn't have long before the desert claimed what the Holt brothers hadn't. He tried to stand, meaning to fetch water from his saddlebag, but when he reached back, a sudden shot cracked in the far distance, echoing off the canyon walls, startling the mare and sending a shiver through Mara that cut right through him. And though the shot was far too far to have been aimed at them with purpose, Elias felt the ghost of his old instincts coil tight in his spine, warning him this night was already claimed by something wicked. He gripped his side, not from fear, but from a pain he'd been ignoring since morning. A dull stab that spread when he twisted. Something he'd chalked up, to age, to long rides, to the cold settling into his bones. But now it sharpened, hot and sudden, and when he tried to crouch again beside Mara, his vision blurred at the edges. She looked up then, finally seeing the strain on his face, and for the first time her fear shifted into concern, timid but real, and she reached a shaking hand as if to steady him before remembering her own words and pulling it back, though her eyes stayed locked on his like she regretted the distance between them. Elias tried to speak, tried to tell her he was fine, that he just needed a moment, but the ground pitched beneath him like a boat caught in a storm, and he felt something wet on his lower shirt. Warm, spreading, something he hadn't noticed in the chaos of finding her. He forced his fingers beneath the fabric and felt a tear he hadn't known was there, the edges sticky with dried blood, as if a bullet had grazed him earlier without his mind registering it, maybe from a stray shot miles out on his patrol, or from someone watching him without his knowing, and he cursed under his breath because it meant he was already weaker than he thought, weaker than the situation allowed, and Mara's eyes widened as she noticed the dark stain blooming across his side, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders as she leaned forward without thinking, her instincts battling her terror, her trembling hand hovering inches from his wound. Elias tried to warn her not to strain herself, not to leave her injuries unattended, but the words tangled in his throat, and for a moment both of them stayed frozen amid the quiet desert, two souls barely held together by fate and failing strength, until the second shot rang out far closer than the first, so close the dust jumped beneath their feet, and the mare reared with a panicked scream, and Elias reached for Mara out of instinct, to pull her down, to shield her, yet before his fingers even brushed the air near her shoulder, his knees gave out, his body swayed, and the world tilted into a hazy red blur. Mara gasped his name for the first time, voice cracking as she crawled toward him, despite the agony in her limbs, and Elias felt the last of his strength melt away, his vision narrowing on her terrified face framed by the dying light of sundown, and just before darkness swallowed him whole, he heard something move in the brush behind them, slow, deliberate, human, and then the sheriff collapsed fully into the dust at Mara's feet as the footsteps drew closer. The darkness that swallowed Elias felt thick and endless, like drifting through the belly of a storm with no thunder to guide him. And when consciousness finally clawed its way back, he heard Mara's trembling, settled into her bones, yet she didn't pull her hand away from his grip. Instead, she steadied it, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "Then tell me who they are." But he shook his head with a pain deeper than injury, as if secrets themselves carved wounds that bled. "Knowing my name is danger enough," he murmured, his voice fading like a dying ember, and Clara realized she was sheltering a man whose past was not merely troubled, it was hunted. She stood and moved toward the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to see the white expanse outside, the snowstorm easing into a bitter stillness that made every sound carry farther, and in that stillness she saw it. Faint movement near the tree line, shadows shifting with the slow deliberation of men who didn't need to hurry, men who already believed the land belonged to their boots. Her breath caught. They were coming. She turned to the stranger. This wounded soul fate had delivered to her doorstep, and she saw something new in his storm-gray eyes, something like shame, sorrow, and resignation twisted together. "Clara," he rasped, surprising her with the way he spoke her name like he'd known it long before she ever said it. "You should leave. Run. Take what you can and vanish into the hills. They won't chase a woman alone." But Clara Hensley had not survived 3 winters of loneliness by running. She stepped closer, her shawl brushing the floorboards, and met his gaze with the quiet, unbroken strength of a woman who had buried fear so deep inside she no longer recognized it. "I won't leave you to die," she said, and the stranger's face tightened with a mixture of agony and awe, as if he'd forgotten people like her, still existed in a world that had taken everything from him. He tried again to rise, but pain shot through him, and he collapsed back with a strained groan, clutching his ribs where old wounds met fresh terror. Clara moved on instinct, gathering Henry's old rifle from above the mantel, checking the chamber, bracing herself against the life or death decision she never imagined she'd face again. She wasn't a gunslinger, but she'd fired enough rounds to understand the weight of a trigger, the way the world shifted the moment a bullet left the barrel. Outside, the shadows grew clearer. 3 men, maybe 4, moving with the confidence of wolves that had already tasted blood. Clara's heart pounded, but she didn't let her hands shake. Instead, she spoke to the stranger without turning, her eyes locked on the approaching danger. "Who are they to you?" And after a long, pained silence, his voice answered with the heaviness of truth. "They were my brothers in arms, before they betrayed me," he said, each word cut with bitterness. "We rode under a man named Baron Slate, rancher on the outside, butcher in the dark. When I tried to stop what he was doing, they marked me for dead." Clara swallowed hard. She knew the Slate name. Whispers from travelers, tales spoken with lowered voices about land thefts, disappearances, a lawman found in a creek with his badge carved out of his chest. If the stranger truly walked away from Slate's men, then his presence here meant the storm outside was nothing compared to the one now heading straight for her door. The first knock wasn't a knock. It was a boot slamming hard into the wood, rattling dishes on the shelves. "Open up!" a voice barked, deep and vicious. "We know he's in there!" Clara steadied her breath, gripping the rifle tighter. The stranger forced himself upright, sweat rolling from his temples, his voice near breaking. "Clara, don't do this! They'll kill you!" She turned just enough to look at him, her eyes calm in a way only grief and survival can carve. "I've already lost one man I love to the west," she said softly. "I won't lose another without a fight." A second kick splintered the lower boards. Snow drifted in through the cracks. Clara took position behind the table, barrel pointed at the door. The stranger, fighting consciousness, dragged himself toward her, but his strength crumbled before he got far. The door exploded inward, wood flying, and 3 men stormed in, coats heavy with frost, faces buried beneath bandanas, guns drawn with the ease of men who killed enough to no longer remember the count. "Where is he?" the leader demanded, stepping forward with a sneer. Clara steadied the rifle. "You'll step back," she warned, her voice clear despite the terror twisting inside her. The men laughed, sharp, cruel. "Lady, you got no idea who you're dealing with." The leader shifted his weight to advance, and Clara fired. The blast cracked through the cabin, deafening in the tight space. The leader staggered back with a howl as the shot tore across his shoulder. Chaos erupted. 2 other men lunged forward, tackling Clara as the rifle fell from her grasp, skidding across the floor. She kicked, fought, clawed, but one struck her hard across the cheek, sending stars bursting across her vision. The stranger let out a broken roar, dragging himself up with what little life he had left. He tackled the man closest to Clara, wrestling for the gun, blood dripping from reopened wounds, but desperation fueled him. For a moment, the cabin became a whirlwind of fists, boots, curses, and splintering wood. Clara crawled toward the rifle, every inch a battle, her breath burning. Behind her, she heard the stranger cry out as a boot drove into his ribs, the leader shouting, "Hold him! Baron wants him alive!" Clara grabbed the rifle, rolled onto her back, and fired again, this time hitting the man standing over the stranger. He collapsed with a grunt, dropping his weapon. The last remaining attacker swung his gun toward Clara, then froze. The stranger, bleeding heavily, had picked up the fallen man's revolver and aimed it at him, hands shaking but determined. For a long heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the last outlaw slowly raised his hands and backed out the broken doorway, fleeing into the snow. Silence returned, heavy, trembling, unreal. Clara rushed to the stranger, catching him as he collapsed. "Stay with me," she whispered, pressing her hand to his wound. "Don't you dare leave now." He looked at her, eyes softening even as pain clouded them. "You saved me, twice," he murmured, his breath shallow. "I never even told you my name." Clara shook her head fiercely. "Then tell me now." His lips curved in the faintest, weary smile. "Elias," he breathed. "Elias Ward." She held him, tears warm against the cold air drifting through the broken doorway. And as dawn crept over Timberline Ridge, painting the snow in pale gold, Elias regained strength little by little under Clara's care. Days turned into weeks. Danger faded into distant rumor, and 2 souls, broken in different ways, found something in each other the West had long denied them. A new beginning carved from survival, sacrifice, and a fate neither saw coming. And though the land remained wild, and shadows still whispered of men like barren slate, Clara and Elias stood together against whatever might come, bound not by chance, but by the night she pulled him from death's hand. That was the day their destinies changed. That was the day the West decided their story was not finished.